Ancient histories first point to the emperor's feud with Apollodorus of Damascus as proof that he was beginning to lose his grip. Hadrian, who always fancied himself an excellent architect, had designed a great temple of Venus that was dedicated in Rome in 135. Proud of what he considered a magnificent work of art, Hadrian asked the greatest architect of his generation, Apollodorus, to comment on the design and construction. Obviously fishing for compliments, Hadrian was deeply grieved when Apollodorus sent back a stern critique of the building's foundation, the line of sight for visitors approaching along the sacred way, the size of the doors, they were too small, and the size of the statue of Venus inside, it was too large. If Venus ever wished to go out for a stroll, Apollodorus caustically informed the emperor, she would be unable to fit through the entryway. Now, the emperor and the architect had been on tense terms for years. Standard legend has it that at some point during the Dacian Wars, Hadrian had interrupted a conference between Trajan and Apollodorus to offer his own opinion of the project they were discussing, and Apollodorus, incensed that this young amateur was even approaching the grown-ups table, dismissed Hadrian, telling him to go back to his drawings, that he understood none of this. Relations between the enthusiastic amateur and the proud professional never got much better, though Hadrian seems to have respected Apollodorus enough that he asked the architect to help design war machines that would allow the legions to attack Jewish cave bases during the Third Jewish War. But respect or no, Cassius Dio reports that when Hadrian read Apollodorus's critique, that he became enraged and ordered the architect banished from Rome, and shortly thereafter had him executed. If this seems like an overly rash response to what was probably reasonable criticism, you're right, and most modern historians do not believe that Apollodorus was actually killed by Hadrian, but that instead, the old architect simply died of natural causes around the time of the exchange, and that Hadrian's enemies drew their own libelous conclusions. But if the crime itself never took place, the mood of Hadrian's last years certainly made believing that the crime did take place easy to swallow, and that, more than anything else, is the moral of the story. Because while he may not have executed Apollodorus, the emperor's treatment of his own family is confirmed fact. Placing Apollodorus's blood on Hadrian's hands is not so much a matter of falsely accusing the innocent, as it is adding one more name to the list. As 130 began to consume the emperor, that, and the completion of his great mausoleum on the banks of the Tiber, which is still standing in Rome, so go visit that too. For Gnaeus Pedanius Fuscus, the only living male relative of the emperor, this should have come as welcome news. Fuscus was Hadrian's teenage great-nephew, the grandson of his sister and a powerful senator named Lucius Julius Servianus. But unfortunately for Fuscus, Hadrian had watched the boy grow up and determined that he was utterly unfit for power, that his tastes were too lavish and too petty, a Nero in the making if there ever was one. Hadrian's unwillingness to commit to Fuscus greatly annoyed his grandfather Servianus, who was past 90 years old, but still growing strong. Servianus and Hadrian had never gotten along, and the fact that they were brothers-in-law seems only to have widened the gap, rather than bridge it. It certainly did not help that it had been widely reported Servianus's was one of the few names Trajan had ever firmly put forward as a possible worthy heir to the throne back in 116-117. That he had been passed over in favor of his younger, cockier brother-in-law, likely through the machinations of a woman at that, had always stuck in Servianus's craw. But in his last years, the unmistakable reality that his grandson was the only man living with a blood relation to the emperor seemed to Servianus to resemble some kind of cosmic justice. But in defiance of this cosmic justice, Hadrian determined that whoever he chose, young Fuscus would not be his man, blood ties be damned. This second Passover of Servianus's family maybe would have gone without incident had Hadrian chosen as heir someone whose worth could not be denied by anyone, much as nervous choice of Trajan had put to rest every other claim on power, even amongst those who really thought they deserved the call. Hadrian could have settled Servianus's discontent by choosing some worthy man, like, for example, and I'm just throwing this out there, Sextus Julius Severus, the troubleshooting general who had just won the war in Judea. But instead, in 136, prompted by a massive hemorrhage that nearly killed him, Hadrian announced to a shocked Roman world that he was adopting a relatively obscure and unaccomplished man named Lucius Caeonius Commodus. Muckrakers immediately pointed to Lucius's reputation as a pretty dilettante as the deciding factor, but the emperor's sympathizers argued that Hadrian was playing a game of four-dimensional chess with the succession issue that only the brilliant emperor himself could fully understand. I, of course, would adopt the boring conclusion that it was likely somewhere in between these two extremes. The choice of Lucius, who changed his name to Lucius alias Caesar when the adoption went through, does seem a curious one taken on its own, though. Lucius was a capable enough senator, but he had well-known health problems, likely suffering from tuberculosis. If Hadrian wanted to ensure the stability of the dynasty and the empire, choosing the perpetually bedridden Lucius was an odd choice to say the least. But, like I say, it is entirely possible that Hadrian was looking beyond Lucius to the man or men he really wanted to control the empire down the road. Lucius would be his stopgap, his very own Nerva, to bridge the interregnum between Hadrian and the young men he really had his eyes on. But before we get into them, it is worth mentioning one other salient detail about Lucius that may have recommended him to the emperor. Namely, that he was the son-in-law of Publius Nigrinus, one of the 4 ex-consuls who had been murdered in 118. Hadrian was concerned about his legacy, and the choice of Lucius may have been an olive branch to the Senate, an admission that he understood their anger and that he wanted to set things right. Most agree, though, that Lucius was not the true object of the emperor's plans, that the fourth dimension of Hadrian's scheme was the grandson of one of the emperor's closest friends and advisors, Marcus Aeneas Verus. Born with his father and grandfather's name, young Marcus Verus, then 15 years old, had caught the emperor's attention early as an unusually serious and intelligent boy. Having been raised in part by his grandfather, who Hadrian held in the highest esteem, young Marcus was marked from the beginning as one worth watching. As the emperor watched Marcus grow up, he was impressed more and more with the studious and capable teenager. We'll get more into the biographical particulars of the man history will come to know as Marcus Aurelius in our next episode, but I just want to note for now that upon Lucius's adoption in 136, Marcus was engaged to Lucius's daughter almost immediately. Though he had a son of his own, a 6-year-old also named Lucius Caeonius Commodus, Hadrian seems to have been setting things up so that when the perpetually ill Lucius Caesar inevitably succumbed to one of his many ailments, power would transfer naturally to his new son-in-law, Marcus. This, of course, begs us to ask the question, why not just adopt Marcus straight away? Why take the scenic route through Lucius? The one obvious answer is that at 15, Marcus may have been a promising candidate for power, but was not yet seasoned enough for Hadrian's taste. Nero and Caligula had proven the folly of allowing the young too much power. Lucius, though weakly constituted, was still in the prime of his middle age, and would likely last long enough to at least get Marcus into his mid-20s, at which point he would hopefully have enough experience to temper the excesses of youth. But who knows, maybe Hadrian was trying to have his cake and eat it too. Adopt the son-in-law of Nigrinus to appease the Senate, knowing full well that Lucius would die off quickly and Hadrian's real choice of heir could take over. The choice of Lucius appears to have been too much for Servianus and Fuscus to take. Fuscus especially saw the throne as his birthright, and when he learned that he had been passed over, just as his grandfather had before him, the young man set himself on a plan to overthrow the aging Hadrian and seize power for himself. At some point in late 137, Hadrian's spy network informed him of the plot, and the emperor took decisive action. He seized young Fuscus, who was no doubt close at hand, as he was still a member of the imperial court, even if his relevance was now virtually non-existent. Feeling the brunt of the emperor's wrath, the young alleged usurper was ordered to commit suicide. Not enough, and shortly after Fuscus's death, Hadrian unexpectedly turned on Servianus and ordered him too to commit suicide. The Roman elites could take in stride the political assassination of a young man who was very possibly himself plotting political assassination, but forcing an old man to end his life in such a dishonorable way especially one who had spent that life nobly serving the empire, was a pointless outrage. Servianus, as you can imagine, was himself outraged, but after firmly avowing his innocence and his fidelity both to Rome and the emperor, he did indeed kill himself. But before he died, he swore one solemn, bitter prayer. May Hadrian long for death, yet be unable to die. It seems clear that the case against Servianus was trumped up, and that Hadrian was finally acting on a long-held grudge. But what are we to make of Fuscus's alleged coup plot? For the Senate, it was not even a matter of debate. Hadrian had invented charges against, and then murdered, his great-nephew to ensure that his own diabolical plans for the future of Rome progressed unhindered. Some sources claim that other men of senatorial rank were also caught up in Hadrian's paranoid net and killed at the same time, implying that Hadrian had basically cooked up a wide-ranging conspiracy so he could prosecute anyone who might trouble his plan for succession. In the end, it's really hard to tell what's true and what's not, especially given the Senate's clear enmity toward Hadrian. But given the emperor's mood at the time, it is possible that he did engage in a carefully planned purge to clear the path for his chosen heirs, and perhaps deal a bit of vengeance to his enemies before he died. Some sources even have it that Hadrian's long-estranged wife Sabina was herself caught up in the purge. Because however it happened, she died in early 137, and was thus easily lumped into stories about the emperor's mad reign of terror. Rumor-mongers breathlessly wondered, did he suspect that she would act as Pompeia had when Trajan died, and upset the apple cart of his carefully laid plans? Probably not. Though they had never gotten along personally, Hadrian had always gone out of his way to treat her, and make sure everyone else treated her, with great respect, and in turn, she was as loyal to the regime as anyone. Like with Apollodorus, coincidence is likely leading to conspiracy theory. But if, after the deaths of Fuscus, Servianus, and whoever else, Hadrian thought his house of cards was well in order, he was in for a cruel shock. Just a month after the executions, let's call them what they really were, his heir Lucius Caesar returned from Pannonia, where he had been sent by the emperor to oversee the defense of the Danube frontier for the year. Though Lucius did an admirable job administering the region throughout 137, the climate had taken its toll on the perpetually bedridden new Caesar. Back in Rome, Lucius was preparing to address the Senate on New Year's Day when he became seriously ill. Some report that he overdosed on the medicine he had been prescribed, but whatever the cause, on January the 1st, 138, Lucius Caesar died, sending Hadrian's perhaps too clever by half succession plans into disarray. The Senate breathed a sigh of relief that Lucius had not lived long enough to fall flat on his face as emperor, as they were all fairly sure he would, and hope rippled through the aristocracy that Hadrian would come to his senses and choose a deserving candidate. But, dipping once again into the well of the handsome yet undistinguished, on January 22, 138 AD, Hadrian pulled out another random name to confound professional prognosticators. Titus Aurelius Fulvus Boionius Arius Antoninus was a well-liked senator who had traveled up the cursus honorum with a sort of stable plotting, but he was just about the last man anyone would have guessed Hadrian would adopt as his heir. But the fates work in random ways, and Antoninus suddenly found himself next in line for the throne. This time, the choice would stick, and the man we all now know as Antoninus Pius will soon find himself ruling Rome for the better part of 23 blessedly banal years.